The billionaire's condescending chuckle stings. Play for a tip. Emma's worn apron hides the violin pendant beneath, a secret he mocks without knowing. Dusty strings whisper against her calloused fingertips. Tonight, the music and the power shifts. Aceful despite her worn apron, balanced 3 plates on one arm while carrying a coffee pot in the other. She'd been waitressing here for 2 years, saving every penny she could while her violin case sat untouched in her tiny apartment. The music lessons, the conservatory dreams, the symphony auditions, all of it felt like a lifetime ago. But tonight something was different. Tonight Alexander Stone, a 36-year-old tech billionaire, sat at table 12 with his business partner, completely unaware that the young woman refilling their water glasses had once played at Carnegie Hall. Sometimes fate works in mysterious ways, bringing together 2 strangers who need each other more than they know. Where are you watching from tonight? Emma had learned to move through the restaurant like a dancer, her steps quiet and efficient. She'd perfected the art of being invisible, of blending into the background while wealthy customers discussed million-dollar deals over their pasta. It wasn't always easy, especially when her fingers would unconsciously move across her serving tray as if it were a fingerboard. Muscle memory, refusing to let her forget what she'd once been. Alexander Stone barely glanced up when she approached his table. He was deep in conversation with his business partner Marcus about their latest acquisition. The numbers don't lie, Alexander was saying, his expensive watch catching the candlelight. We're looking at a 30% increase in the first quarter alone. He had that confident air that came with success. Tailored suit perfectly, styled dark hair, and the kind of presence that commanded attention in boardrooms across the country. More wine? Emma asked softly, noting how Alexander's companion kept checking his phone. Please, Marcus replied distractedly. Actually, Alex, I hate to cut this short, but Sarah's having contractions. The baby's coming early. Alexander's demeanor shifted instantly. Go, go. We'll finish this tomorrow. Congratulations, man. As Marcus hurried out, Emma watched Alexander's shoulders drop slightly. For just a moment, the confident businessman looked almost lonely sitting there by himself. She had seen it before. Successful people who had everything except someone to share it with. Her grandmother used to say that money couldn't buy the things that really mattered, and working here had shown her how true that was. Would you like F to box up your dinner? She offered gently. Alexander looked up at her for the first time that evening. Really looked at her. There was something in her eyes, a depth that surprised him. Actually, no. I think I'll stay a while. It's not like there's anyone waiting for me at home. Emma felt a pang of recognition. She knew that feeling all too well. Sometimes being alone isn't the worst thing, she said, then immediately worried she'd overstepped. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. No, it's fine, Alexander said, and his smile was genuine. You're right. Though I have to admit, eating alone in restaurants always makes me feel like everyone's watching. They're not, Emma assured him. Most people are too wrapped up in their own stories to notice anyone else's. Something in her voice made him curious. There was a wisdom there that seemed older than her years, a quiet strength that intrigued him. As she moved to clear Marcus's place setting, Alexander noticed how graceful her hands were, how carefully she handled everything. You know, he said impulsively, this might sound strange, but you don't seem like someone who's meant to be invisible. Emma's hand stilled on the wine glass. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, pain, maybe hope. But then she smiled politely, professionally. We all have our roles to play, don't we? She said softly and walked away before he could ask what she meant. Alexander watched her go, wondering why he suddenly felt like he'd just missed something important. As the evening wore on, the restaurant grew quieter. Emma noticed Alexander still sitting at his table, occasionally taking calls, but mostly just watching the world go by through the window. She'd refilled his coffee twice and brought him a slice of tiramisu he hadn't ordered, claiming it was on the house for solo diners. You don't have to take pity on me, he'd said with a wry smile. I'm not, she'd replied. I just know what it's like to eat alone. Now, as she wiped down the neighboring tables, she could hear him on another business call, his voice tight with frustration. No, that's not what we agreed on, he was saying. The timeline was clear from the beginning. He rubbed his forehead and Emma could see the exhaustion settling into his features. When he finally hung up, she approached with fresh coffee. Rough day, Alexander laughed, but there was no humor in it. Try rough year. Sometimes I wonder if any of it's worth it. You know, all these deals, all these numbers. But what's the point if you don't have anyone to share the victories with? Emma paused in her pouring. What about your family? Parents passed when I was young, built my company from nothing. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to build a life. He looked up at her again, and this time his gaze was searching. What about you? Family dreams? The question hit Emma like a physical blow. Dreams. She hadn't spoken about her dreams in so long. I had dreams once, she said quietly, then caught herself. I mean, everyone does when they're young, right? What kind of dreams? Emma's hand unconsciously moved to her throat where a small violin pendant hung hidden beneath her uniform. Music, she whispered so softly he almost didn't hear her. Alexander leaned forward. You're a musician. The pain that flashed across Emma's face was unmistakable. I was a long time ago. What happened? She was quiet for so long that Alexander thought she wouldn't answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, Life happened. My parents died in a car accident 3 years ago, left me with nothing but debt in my violin. I had to choose between keeping their memory alive through music or keeping myself alive by paying rent. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Alexander had built an empire, but he recognized the weight of impossible choices. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Emma wiped her eyes quickly, professionally. It's fine. I made my choice. But as she started to walk away, Alexander called after her. Wait, what if you didn't have to choose? She turned back, hope and fear whirring in her expression. There's a violin on the wall over there, Alexander said, pointing to the restaurant's decor. Play something for a tip, a big tip. Emma's laugh was shaky, disbelieving. That's just decoration. It probably doesn't even try, Alexander said simply. What's the worst that could happen? If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Emma stared at him, her world balancing on the edge of possibility and terror. Emma's hands trembled as she looked at the violin mounted on the wall. It had been there so long she'd stopped seeing it like everything else that reminded her of the life she'd given up. But now, under Alexander's encouraging gaze, it seemed to glow in the dim restaurant lighting. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head. I haven't played in 3 years. My fingers aren't. I'm not who I used to be. Alexander stood up, his expression gentle but determined. Sometimes we're exactly who we need to be. We just don't know it yet. With careful reverence, he lifted the violin from its display. To their surprise, it was real, dusty and neglected, but real. Emma's breath caught as he held it out to her, and for a moment she just stared at it like it might disappear. The phone. Mr. Romano. He mentioned once that it belonged to his grandmother, Emma said, her voice distant. She played in the old country. Then maybe it's been waiting for the right hands, Alexander suggested softly. Emma's fingers hovered over, the instrument not quite touching. What if I've forgotten everything? What if I disappoint you? Impossible, Alexander said with such certainty that Emma almost believed him. The restaurant was nearly empty now, just a few lingering customers and the soft clink of dishes being cleared in the kitchen. Emma finally took the violin, and the moment it touched her hands, something shifted in her posture. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted slightly, and for the first time since Alexander had been watching her, she looked like she belonged exactly where she was. She tested the strings. They were horribly out of tune, but as she began to adjust them, her movements became more confident, more sure. Muscle memory, 3 years dormant, began to wake up. I should warn you, Emma said, attempting a smile. I used to play classical music, conservatory training, not exactly restaurant background music. Play whatever your heart wants to play, Alexander replied, settling back into his chair. Emma closed her eyes, drew the bow across the strings, and the first note filled the restaurant like a prayer. It was tentative at first, shaky, but then her fingers found their positions, and suddenly she wasn't Emma the waitress anymore. She was Emma the musician, the girl who'd once made grown men cry with her interpretation of Brahms, the young woman who dreamed of playing with the Chicago Symphony. The melody that flowed from the violin was heartbreaking and beautiful. Bach's air on the G string, but played with a vulnerability that transformed it into something entirely new. Every note carried the weight of her loss, her sacrifice, her buried dreams rising to the surface. Alexander sat transfixed. He'd attended countless charity galas, heard professional orchestras, owned recordings by the world's greatest musicians. But this raw, honest, achingly beautiful sound from a 25-year-old waitress in a small Italian restaurant. This was different. This was a soul speaking directly to another soul. As Emma played, tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. 3 years of suppressed grief, of dreams deferred, of feeling invisible, poured out through her fingers and filled the space between them. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. When the last note faded, the silence was profound, sacred even. Emma opened her eyes to find Alexander staring at her in complete amazement. "My God," Alexander breathed, his voice barely audible. "Who are you?" Emma lowered the violin, her hands still trembling, but now from the rush of music rather than fear. "I told you I'm nobody. I'm just no." Alexander stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Nobody doesn't play like that. That was—" He struggled for words. "That was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard." The few remaining customers had stopped their conversations to listen, and now they began to applaud softly. Mr. Romano himself emerged from the kitchen, his weathered face creased with emotion as he looked at his grandmother's violin in Emma's capable hands. "Mia Nonna would have loved that," he said in his thick Italian accent, wiping his eyes. "She always said her violin was waiting for the right spirit to wake it up again." Emma carefully set the violin down, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions coursing through her. Playing again had been like coming home after a long exile, like breathing after holding her breath for 3 years. But now reality was crashing back in. "Thank you," she said to Alexander, her voice thick with unshed tears. I needed that more than you know. But I should get back to work." "Wait," Alexander said, his mind racing. "You can't just play like that and then go back to serving coffee. That's insane." Emma's smile was sad but resigned. "Dreams are a luxury I can't afford, Mr. Stone. I have rent to pay, bills to cover. The music world is competitive, and I'm 3 years behind everyone else now." But Alexander was already pulling out his phone. "What if you weren't behind? What if you had a chance to catch up?" He was typing rapidly, his business mind shifting into high gear. "I know people. The Chicago Symphony, the Lyric Opera, private collectors who sponsor young artists." "Please don't," Emma said quietly, placing her hand over his phone. "I can't handle hope right now. Hope is what broke me the first time." Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear beneath the resignation. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself. The terror of wanting something so badly that the thought of losing it again was paralyzing. "What if it wasn't about hope?" he asked gently. "What if it was just about what you deserve?" Before Emma could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID made him straighten up immediately. It was Margaret Chen, the director of the Chicago Symphony's Youth Development Program, someone he donated to generously over the years. "I have to take this," he said to Emma, "but please don't go anywhere." As Alexander stepped away to answer the call, Emma sank into a nearby chair, emotionally drained, but somehow lighter than she'd felt in years. She touched the violin strings gently, marveling at how natural it had felt to play again. Mr. Romano approached with 2 cups of espresso. "For 30 years that violin hung silent on my wall," he said, sitting beside her. "Tonight you gave it voice again. Sometimes fate works in mysterious ways." "No. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales." Emma nodded, watching Alexander pace by the window as he spoke animatedly into his phone, gesturing with his free hand. Maybe, just maybe, some dreams were worth the risk of hope. Alexander returned to the table with an expression Emma couldn't quite read, excitement mixed with something deeper, more thoughtful. He sat down across from her, setting his phone aside with deliberate care. "Margaret Chen wants to meet you," he said simply. Emma's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. The Margaret Chen from the Chicago Symphony, I sent her a recording, Alexander admitted, holding up his phone. I recorded the last part of your performance. She listened to it while we were talking, and he paused, watching Emma's face carefully. She wants to offer you a spot in their emerging artist program, full scholarship plus a living stipend. The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Emma stared at Alexander, then at the violin, then back at Alexander again. That's impossible. Those programs have waiting lists years long. The audition process alone takes months. Not when you play like that, Alexander said gently, and not when you have someone willing to vouch for your character as well as your talent. Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different. Not tears of grief or regret, but of something she was afraid to name. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for a stranger? Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because tonight you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Success isn't just about building something big. It's about recognizing something beautiful when you see it and having the courage to protect it. He smiled, and for the first time all evening, it reached his eyes. Besides, we're not strangers anymore, are we? Emma laughed through her tears, a sound like music itself. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Alexander said. This is just the beginning. The real work starts now. Practice, auditions, competitions, but you won't be doing it alone. Mr. Romano approached their table with a small, wrapped bundle. Take this, he said, pressing the violin case into Emma's hands. Nona always said her violin would know when it found its true home. I think tonight it found that home. Emma hugged the case to her chest, overwhelmed by the kindness of near strangers who had somehow seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. I don't know what to say. Say you'll play again, Alexander said. Say you'll let the world hear what I heard tonight. I will, Emma promised, and for the first time in 3 years, she meant it completely. As they walked out of Romanos together, Emma carrying her violin and Alexander carrying a lightness he hadn't felt in years, neither of them could have predicted how this chance encounter would bloom into a friendship that changed both their lives. Alexander would become Emma's most devoted patron, attending every performance, cheering from the front row as she rebuilt her career. And Emma, with her music, would remind him that the best investments weren't always measured in dollars. 6 months later, when Emma played her debut solo with the Chicago Symphony, she dedicated her performance to the stranger who believed in dreams when I'd forgotten how to dream. Alexander, sitting in the front row with tears in his eyes, knew exactly what she meant. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you to change everything. Thank you for joining Emma and Alexander on their journey.